Hello, I'm Duncan Welder from Risk, and welcome to the second installment of our xAPI in Action series. This is a series of video interviews and blogs highlighting xAPI-enabled projects and processes that are underway by forward-thinking people in the learning and development space. Today, I'm excited to have the opportunity to interview Amy Parent. Amy's the Director of Learning Ecosystems at Salience Learning, and Amy brings an amazing energy to the table. You can see her passion for helping drive innovation and value in L&D projects. Every time I have the opportunity to speak with Amy, it absolutely recharges my batteries, gets my mind moving, and reminds me why I love this industry. So without further ado, let's bring Amy on.
Hello. Hi, Duncan. You are too kind. Thank you so much for
Oh
having
no,
me here today.
thank you for joining me. I'd love for you to tell us who you are and a little bit
Yeah,
about Salience Learning.
I have been in the learning and development space. Actually, um, it's getting on. I have finally reached a point where I can say 15 years plus and leave it at that. I started out as an educational technologist, in the K through 12 space, working with principals, superintendents, and teachers in implementing, technology into their learning solutions and their learning experiences. So that was way back when I first graduated. And I have since, moved into the industry space, the private sector space, and mostly in the consulting world these days. Between my work at the Neuro Leadership Institute and my work now at Salience Learning. So, Salience Learning, we do focus in the life science and pharmaceutical industry in trying to help these businesses bring the science of learning to the learning of science. And we have recently released, as of almost 2 years ago, our first set of academies around critical thinking, strategic thinking, and generating insights in that space. All important capabilities needed for life sciences and pharmaceuticals to do their best and their most innovative work. So that's where we are. And I helped launch those digital solutions and the infrastructure and the ecosystem that's behind it.
I love that. I think that's the first time I've heard it put that way, bringing learning science to bear in the learning of science. I had always appreciated the tagline, "We make the complex simple," which is certainly one of those things that should always be our goal. And with exceptions for some geeks like me, generally our end users and clients aren't that interested in the technology that's underpinning a solution. It's how do we make things simple, effective, and as bulletproof as possible to keep them, coming back there. But it's an interesting space, between pharmaceutical and um, life science being one heavily regulated, very
Yes.
fast moving, fast developing industry. Information has to be accurate. You
Yeah.
can't pull people away from jobs for an undue amount of time. I can certainly see where the challenges lie there. And then teaching what I consider relatively very complex skills, right? Things like
Yes.
critical thinking and taking some kind of a structured approach for making decisions is not something that you come across lightly very often.
No,
So,
no. And
so.
yes, and to your point, the industry in itself is complex, and the evolution and the speed of innovation is a challenge in of itself to try and keep up with and keep others informed, including healthcare professionals, patients, and the folks within those
That's right.
organizations too.
Yeah, you have tendrils that kind of run
Yes,
everywhere there.
amok.
Uh, Now, Amy, we've overlapped at conferences for a number of years, xAPI camps, learning cohorts.
Yeah.
Um, what is it that sparked your interest in xAPI, and how'd you get involved there?
Oh, the origin story. I unpacked this recently with Megan Torrance over at Torrance Learning. And the origin story, I think we figured out, goes back to 2016. So I think it was only maybe 3 years or 2 years into the cohort. I was working at Grovo. It was
Mhm.
a learning management system, sort of, that focused on the development of microlearning at the time in video formats. And I was a instructional designer there. And I was at the DevLearn
Mhm.
conference when I heard about xAPI, went to a couple of sessions around the topic. And what really sparked me was I immediately just saw an entire world of measuring, taking a scientific process, because I have a background, in biology and science, which is where I was in college, and wanting to always unpack that, bring that to the work that I did as an instructional designer. So I ran back to Grovo, all excited about this. Started to talking to our developers internally about what I had been learning, and I mean, they just looked at me like I had 10 heads on my shoulders. Like, but it gave me more incentive to like be able to articulate it even better. And through that journey, I discovered the cohort, the xAPI cohort. And then that's when I got my hands dirty and, had that empowering moment of sending my first statement and unpacking the code. Um, and I have been hooked ever since and on a mission ever since.
That's fantastic. Yeah, you came through a very similar route, starting out with, oh gosh, the old tin can shootouts
Yeah.
at the DevLearn conference and the Learning Guild shows, and then getting involved with the cohorts and moving through where you really get to do more hands-on activity there that can help drive new projects and really spark so much thought and excitement about the opportunities that we have inside of an L&D world. One of the things that I've always thought about is how do we get the data that we need to support uh, kind of moving forward and advancing this craft, because we've
Yeah.
worked very often in a bit of a data desert, where we didn't have a lot of good information that we could use to support the things that we're doing. So we're in a position then of going to stakeholders and asking for time, asking for funding to
Hmm.
initiate projects, and saying, I'm not really sure what the end result is going to be, but I feel like we're going to do good things,
Yeah.
which is not a great way to sell a project, especially if you have an engineering group sitting next door to you that says, "All right, if you spend this money, you can have a payoff in 31 days." Like,
Yeah.
oh well, that's very hard for me to compete with in an L&D world. So,
That's right.
yeah.
And I also saw, not only that aspect of like understanding and really diving, at that time, the user experience was, trending hard as part of how do we think about digital learning and assembling it and all of that. So that those worlds were colliding kind of all around the same time. And of course, they're all, you need data at the end of the day to really understand and be able to make informed decisions out of that moving forward. So that's my story.
And I think you're right there. You have this big push for being learner centered,
Hmm.
and if you're not collecting data to help make better decisions about what learners need and what they use, then you're operating at a disadvantage. The other side is, if we're going to really move forward with things like personalization of learning
Hmm.
and adaptability and feeding people just the content that they need at the time
Yeah.
that they need it, we have to have some data to base that on, and that's part of the reason you're here today, because I know you've been working on something that's near and dear to my heart, data governance and establishing some kind of measurement approach for training. I regularly recommend that content and learning experience developers start with the end in mind. So that when they approach a project, what's the end goal?
Yeah.
Is it evaluating content? Is it tracking student behavior, supporting adaptability? Because if you know that, then you can back up and help instrument that project to get the data that you need.
Yep.
It also helps identify if there are other data sources that you're going to need to tap, so you avoid uh, really getting into a glut of simply recording everything and trying to make sense out of that. What is the process that you guys are using for building a strategy around determining, I guess, if you will, how content will be instrumented for getting the data that you need?
Yeah. So, I pull on a couple of on my roots really, in scientific design, right? So I start
Hmm.
with really understanding the problem that we're trying to solve and some of the key questions that are, at top of our mind in wanting to understand things around how impactful um, the learning experience was, right? And in just saying those words, how impactful the learning experience was, you then find yourself having to unpack that a little bit and
Hmm.
defining what some of those different key variable and factors are that matter. And my approach is a culmination of a lot of people's work in the space. So, I really looked at the work that Will Telheimer has done around, the learning transfer
Hmm.
model, the L10 model that he put together, built off of the work of Kirkpatrick. I've also have leaned a lot on some early thinkers, Putnam. Is it Scott Putnam?
Sean,
Sean Putnam. Yes, Sean
sure.
Putnam. In his early thinking, which was very much a scientific process too, around data and measuring what to measure in learning. And then most recently, kind of evolving and maturing our entire approach around this idea of a combination of expertise from a learning engineering perspective, right? So, and you used a really important word that it's a word that I think is really important today is instrumenting. So,
Hmm.
often when we are designing learning, we're thinking about the learning experience itself, the parts and the pieces that we need to build, digital or not digital, slide deck or not, depending on what we're building. But we never, that word instrumentation, I think really adds an element of maturity and another framework to be thinking around that really speaks to xAPI and metrics inputs and outputs. Um, so that's kind of really where I start. What is the core problem we're solving for, and what are the key questions that are going to help us understand everything from did it work? Did it work from a learning perspective? Did it work from a user perspective? Did it work from a navigational perspective, a delivery perspective? So I think all of those are the elements that we look at.
Okay, and that's kind of the list of, you said that these key factors on impactfulness
Yeah,
of the learning experience, right? Those are those, like, what does work there? What are
yeah.
some of are there other specifics that you found or questions that you might ask yourself?
Yeah, so I've really honed it down into three core areas, and this is a combination of research that's been being done in the space for a while around metrics and what is of value and has legs when it comes to probability of impact. Um, to what is it that you intuitively need to collect evidence-wise as pure evidence that something is happening, right? Whether
Mhm.
it be learning or use or application. Somebody else coined this phrase, and I haven't been able to remember who it is. So perhaps if somebody's listening, they can chime in. But this concept of a chain of events, right? So this idea that first they got to get in, they got to be able to access it. So we call that the engagement bucket, right? They got in, they completed it, they kept coming back, right? They did everything that we asked them to do, right? Your basic metrics, which usually come from your scoring packages or any LMS or a system of delivery that you're using. But then you start thinking about the learning side of it, right? So, well, okay, just because they did it doesn't mean they actually learned anything, right? We all know that. We do things all the
Sure.
time. I watched that YouTube video. I couldn't tell you anything about what was on it. And so we hone in on core metrics that are a combination of perception of learning and actual evidence of learning. So we try to strike that balance. And our rationale there is sometimes the perception and the reality have a gap in them, and sometimes they're aligned, right? So we want to be able to tell that part of the story. And then the last bucket is application, right? The holy grail. Okay, so this is very much following all of our learning models, no matter which one you're using. And then we think to ourselves, well, what are the kinds of evidence we can collect? And what are the perception criteria that we know if this is high, the likelihood of application is very high too, right?
Uh,
So confidence,
mhm.
motivation, things like that.
No, I had made note of that as you were going through there, and I thought, oh, what a great concept to discuss that perception versus evidence of actual progressing in training. But I think you're right. What you touched on there is really that correlation to if I feel like I've come out of that
Mhm.
training or learning experience, with a higher level of skills and greater confidence, then I'm going to be more likely to make that application on the job. And then if there is a gap, how do I find those things? So that's interesting. 'Cause I've thought of kind of similar silos, if you will, of
Right.
types of data that we can instrument in xAPI, right? So there's some things that I need really exclusively for monitoring the use of content and seeing how people are going through
Hmm.
that. It's actually I had a conversation with Megan Torrance in the last session, and she had said that they have data that they're gathering now on different elements that are used in this learning tool
Hmm.
that they'll probably stop tracking at some point because it will no longer make a difference. It will no longer make a difference if people are listening to the audio track as a
Yeah.
podcast or they're going through it as slides. Now it's important for them to know that 30% of people listen in a podcast only mode,
Hmm.
and ultimately their results when it comes to learning transfer seem to be the same. So, how do you move forward with those? So,
Right.
that kind of usage area, certainly there's the silo around, you know, ensuring or documenting, providing evidence that I could perform those tasks or answer
Yeah.
the questions, do whatever the training had a goal of helping me do. And then I think there's that whole higher level area where it's like, what are other things we can use? Say if we want to have more advanced interactions, some kind of collaborative work that's
Yeah.
happening inside, and relying on xAPI to do that.
Yeah. Well, we have actually been moving in that direction. So once we kind of establish this, I don't know, I kind of call it an experiment. It's always an experiment in my world, right?
That's a scientist in you.
Right. I'm like, well, let's try this model and this approach and let's see what comes of it, what kind of story we can tell, and how reliable that story really is. So there's a couple of things that we've instrumented along that learner journey. We have done the pre and the post assessment, and
Mhm.
we've been looking at it's not a knowledge assessment. We don't look at it that way because the reality of the work that we're doing, it's really about application and using, right? So we know knowing, you can know a lot of stuff, but you don't know how to use it. There's
Sure.
often a gap there and vice versa. Um, so we have instrumented this with xAPI calls built on the back, so that it makes it really easy for us to query that data and then processes it in a way that we can compare it, because it's in the same data structure and the same questions, et cetera. So it works really, really well that way. And then we also have that data to query over cohorts and different groups of people, until we change and update something about the program, right? So that's one element of trying to capture changes in behavior
Mhm.
through learning, if you will. It's all perception though, right? So we need to like really back that up. So another thing that we haven't instrumented it for xAPI yet, but it's in the works. So we have folks actually do a project. We use a kind of report where they have to tell us a situation. They have to pick some approaches based on what's in the learning. Then they have to put it into practice and report out lessons learned, like what worked, what didn't work, what kind of results did they get when they actually tried this technique in the workplace. Um, right now, that's done in a like a PDF, fillable PDF kind of
Mhm.
form. Um, so it's prime now to like take it to that next level and see what the next point will be. What do we actually build the data calls on there? Like what do we actually collect on that as the anecdotal evidence to add to our story? So those are some ideas. And then the one that I've had this for a long time, and it goes back to when you mentioned the opportunity for a specification like xAPI to be able to create feedback loops, whether it be for adaptive learning, personalization of learning, and even just long-term personal tracking of learning, right? I feel like we haven't quite touched on that opportunity yet in xAPI. And one of the early stages of us trying to do that at Salience Learning is using implementation and intention plans. And there's just many little statements. They're from the behavioral sciences space. And it's a technique where you just kind of commit to something very, very tiny, like a simple action that's triggered by a specific moment when you need it most. So, for example, at the beginning of the meeting, I will ask people how their day is going, right? I want to change the way I start my meetings is the behavioral intent that I'm trying to
Mhm.
shift. And so we have that instrumented now to be able to send those intentions to the learner record store. And we collect them and we track them and we follow up on them with learners about how's it going, how are you doing, what progress are you making. But we haven't quite got it back to the learner yet so that they can self-update and self-report. And that's, I think, a really cool opportunity and one example of how xAPI can create those feedback loops in combination with using things like machine learning and AI and all of that to make it happen. And I know there's people out there that are working on that. So,
No, that's brilliant. I love the idea of collecting, both that, say, confidence intention kind of data and being able to couple it with that direct feedback that you're getting
mhm,
from learners, because those are not things that are always aligned either. The
right.
way that I feel about um, in a learning experience may not be positive, but it could be very effective. Um, the reality of it is, just because I like something doesn't necessarily mean it was effective or valuable to me. Being able to, to look at what does work and what you get positive feedback on to keep people engaged, and then also be able to start making not necessarily predictions, but recommendations on the right path for this person to continue their journey. So much is reliant on governance, because you
Mm,
said you get that data and it's all easy and queryable and in the same format and in the same place. And then you can slice and dice it between two different cohorts or two different academies over a span of time, or
yeah.
before and after our introduction of a learning experience. So to me, if you're going to get that data back and it's going to be valuable, then you really have to have good guidelines in place for making sure that you're collecting consistent
Hmm.
quality data, and data that you know what it means,
Yeah.
because it's easy to draw an incorrect conclusion because we're calling things apples and apples, but they're really not.
Yeah.
Um,
That's a real challenge. I think it has taken me personally a few years to kind of have a point of view on some of that in my own work and be like, no, 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 we are not going to use submit in this instance. Like we're just not, because it's going to mean something different for this use case versus that use case, and we're going to do that universally. And I think my understanding is there's effort in the space to try and develop those profiles, at least when one back end already built in kind of data call is using submit, like it's a universal use of submit at that level across all built-in data calls for around xAPI, instead of it varying, because it can be messy really fast.
That's right, and I think, even before, and you're right, there's definitely activity on profiles inside, some of those IEEE working groups
Yeah,
now, but even the predecessor to that, having defined vocabularies. When I say launched, I mean launched a course, I mean
yeah,
launched a rocket. These are two very different things, and I
yes,
need some way of better defining that. And I think XAPI certainly provides us the technical opportunity to do that, right? Because I
yeah,
have identifiers that will help clarify the difference between launching a course and launching a rocket. It's not really nuance, but at least providing that additional context. And I really think this helps support or reflects at least the maturity of XAPI as it continues to transition from being a relatively new specification just a
mhm,
few years ago to now an IEEE standard.
yeah,
So
it's exciting.
it is. Well, I appreciate you sharing so much. Is there
Mhm.
anything else newer and exciting on the horizon that you want to share, though?
Well, I would love to share the idea that, the work that we've done together. We have done some
Oh, sure.
experiments, absolutely. And, you know, we try to create one kind of feedback loop from our learning experiences by leveraging um, badges, right?
Mhm.
And so you and we kind of figured out how we could leverage a group of xAPI statements and kind of have them be a set of rules, if you will. You're probably better explaining this than me. But conditions that have to be met, like statements that have to come in and be validated in order for that badge to be delivered, and approved for delivery per user. And I thought that was a really cool early example and not a hard one to do. It's kind of exists in other ways out there, but not in the way that we did it, right? Using X action. So
Yep, and I think there are a lot of great examples there. Essentially, what we're
mhm,
doing is saying, let's take in a series of statements, let's analyze those, and then let's take
yes.
some kind of action on those. In a badging system, that might be calling a third-party API that then updates or issues that badge because you have the authority to do that. Or maybe it will send some kind of additional statements off to another system of record. But the number of things you can do, and one of the things
Mm,
I played around with just going into Postman, and you have all of these sample API calls that you can play around with, and some of them don't provide, a lot of deep background information, but you can send a, zip code through an API call, and then get back, the city and state that that zip code is from, or things like that. And the fact that I can now do that based on data that's coming through. We've got a little video out on YouTube where we take training data, and training data turns on a little electronic switch, right? So I can
yeah,
kick on the coffee
that's
maker,
fun.
I could turn on the disco ball, just because I finished training there. So again,
Yeah,
I think there are a lot of opportunities, and I think those simple projects are things that really do help someone
yeah,
see. It's like, oh, okay, I understand that I have a key card to get into a door lock from
Mhm.
RFIDs. And if I go through training, I can send that access system a message that says, hey, Duncan Welder can access this door, or maybe I can't access this other door.
Yeah.
And good concrete examples, not overly complicated, but something that you really can look at using data for automation and learning data, performance data for automation.
Yeah, I think you kind of brought us full circle, Duncan, in that you have to start at the beginning, not after you've designed the learning, and think to yourself, what problem am I solving? What core questions do I have around success,
Mhm.
impact, usability, whatever those core questions are? And right from the get go, when you understand what those questions are, then you understand what you want to measure, and then you can really start to see during the design process the instruments you need to think about now. Because if you don't, for example, like with the if then plan example, for example, again, how many times can I say
No.
example? Uh, um, that had to be developed in a specific way. So we had to storyboard that idea out so that when it went to the development team, it actually could be built to function with that intent. If you don't think about it, and we've done this in face-to-face workshops where we didn't think about it ahead of time. And our main way of instrumenting was collecting a bunch of sticky notes. But when we think about it ahead of time, we could instrument for that in a much easier and more efficient way. And we are already planning for those kinds of fixes moving forward. So that's my key takeaway, I think, is think about those questions, that problem that defines your
Intentionality.
data. Yeah, intentionality. And then you can start to pull all the people together that you know who you need to pull together to make it all happen and instrument it and then begin to collect and analyze that data.
All right, Amy, just one more question for you before we wrap up here.
Sure.
What about conferences, professional development opportunities, things that you recommend or you may be participating in?
Oh gosh, yes. Well, I always recommend the xAPI cohort. For those of you who aren't sure what xAPI um, is even about, it's a great place to just kind of show up. And you don't have to get active right away if you're not comfortable. You can, I think it's Megan who coined it lurking.
Yeah, there's lots of lurkers in
Lots
that
of
space.
lurking. I even do it myself. I just listen or hang out or just show up to the weekly webinars, which are really, really impactful. Um, I also recommend the DevLearn conference via the Learning Guild, and in particular, the xAPI showcase that they have there now, which is really fun. You get to see some really cool work, people behind the scenes that you've never even heard of or even knew what they did, and they kind of show up there and really share some great ideas and tips and things that they're doing and just experimenting. And then if you really want to kind of start to understand how to bring a team of people together without hiring a whole team of people, I
Mhm.
think learning engineering is a really great space to understand what role learning engineering has in breaking down silos, pulling in the expertise around you to solve a really cool learning problem together. And then
Well,
it doesn't have to be just L&D or just a developer, in silo. And I think learning engineering is a really great way for organizations to mature the way that they think about solving these complex issues.
yeah, it's being structured in a mindful way, right?
Yeah.
So that we're not just all over the map, and I think that is a big value. All right. Thank you again, Amy, for taking the time out of your schedule to meet today and for all the great work you're doing and for sharing that. For those of you that are joining remotely, as always, if you have questions or comments, there's anything that I can ever help with, never hesitate to reach out. I look forward to your feedback and keep your eyes open for the next installment of xAPI in Action.
Yeah. That was fun. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you again for joining this episode of xAPI in Action. I sincerely appreciate your interest and have enjoyed these shows. I hope you have as well. Going forward, if you ever need to reach out, you can find me, Duncan W. at riskdashing.com. Also, upcoming events, the ATD conference in New Orleans in May, and then the DevLearn conference coming up in Las Vegas in November this year. So a little bit later than last year. But we'll be at both of those, probably some things in between, and look forward to connecting with you anytime. Have a great day.